Join, and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning and good afternoon to everyone today. My name is Zach Pakin. I am a research fellow in the Canada's Role on the Global Stage program at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. For those of you who are not familiar with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, IPD is a young Canadian think tank that is devoted to putting forward and reflecting upon a vision of Canadian foreign policy rooted in the principles of realism and restraint. Today's discussion will center on the role that China should play in Canada's vision of a so-called rules-based international order. We plan to tackle this question conceptually and practically at the same time and methodically over the course of the next hour and 15 minutes. So we're thankful for all of you for having joined us today. A couple of items of housekeeping before we begin. First of all, I want to let you all know that today's panel is the inaugural panel of our China strategy project, which we have just launched. We will be putting together a series of different panels over the course of the coming weeks and months, examining a few key questions regarding the future of Canada-China relations. And today is the first. If you'd like to know more about the China strategy project, you are welcome to go to our website at peacediplomacy.org. And you can go under the tab on the right-hand side where it says projects and click on the China Strategy Project. You'll see a number of papers and articles that have already been published, including one by yours truly. Feel free to check that out, and you can learn a little bit more about our forthcoming planned panels, which will zero in on other key questions relating to the future of Canada's relationship with China. Second of all, I'd like to alert you all as well to our forthcoming East Asia Strategy Forum, which will be taking place later this month. On November the 17th and 18th. You can find out more about the program by going to our website. Again, it's peacediplomacy.org. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a beautiful orange tab where it says EASF 2021. You can click on that and you can register for the particular panels in which you might be interested. We'll be covering a whole range of different dynamics relating to the East Asian region, including regional geopolitics on its own from a non-Canadian perspective, as well as a few panels on Canada in particular. And one of the panels of our China Strategy Project will be taking place on the program of the East Asia Strategy Forum as well. So I hope you'll register for a few of those panels and you'll be able to join us later this month as well. Moving on to today's discussion. One of the most oft-cited phrases related to today's challenge of international order is that we are dealing with a crisis of the so-called rules-based international order. And Canada in particular has dwelled upon this question ever since, at the very least, since Chrystia Freeland was our foreign minister back in Justin Trudeau's first term as prime minister, in which in one of her major speeches given to the Parliament of Canada, she outlined Canada's foreign policy as being rooted in support for and defense of the rules-based international order. But what is this international order? Many years later, much of this still needs to be unpacked conceptually. Canadians have not necessarily discussed this in depth, despite the fact that there have been a few initiatives here and there in the support of multilateralism and international rules-based trade reform, etc. But what is this rules-based order? What are its components? How does Canada relate to this order? And how does China, of course, relate to this order? What interests may we share or not share? We're going to try to unpack all of this and more today. And for this, we have four excellent panelists, and we're very grateful to all of you for having joined us. First of all, we've got Bobo Lowe, who is joining us, I believe, from Brighton, England this morning. Is that correct? Beautiful. And Bobo is a fellow of several organizations, including SIPA in Washington, the Lowy Institute in Australia, and IFRI, the Institut Français des Relations Internationales in Paris. We've got Peggy Mason, who is joining us as well, Canada's former ambassador for disarmament to the United Nations, a member of IPD's advisory board, and president of the Rideau Institute, who I believe is joining us from Ottawa this morning. Good morning, Peggy. Good to see you. David Carment is also in Ottawa this morning. He is a professor of international affairs at Carleton University, as well as a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and a newly minted senior fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy as well. David, thank you for joining us. And finally, Andy Knight, also a new senior fellow with IPD. Thank you for joining us as well. You are a professor of political science at the University of Alberta, as well as a visiting professor at Yale University. And I assume you are joining us from Yale. Excellent, wonderful, good to have you. Okay, we're going to get started. I'm going to go to Bobo first, if you don't mind. And my first question concerns the nature of this international order. We hear about this phrase, the rules-based international order, all the time. But can you really tell us a little bit more about this, right? We always hear that there's been this one international order that has prevailed since 1945, rooted in these very particular set of institutions, the United Nations and the World Bank and the IMF and GATT, et cetera. How true is that? And if it's not true, what is the nature of international order today, in your view?
Oh, thank you very much, Zach. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here to have this, what I think will be a most stimulating discussion. Look, you've hit the nail on the head. I think Western policymakers routinely refer to the rules-based international order, sometimes the liberal international order. But frankly, I think we need to move on. I think today it's unclear what the rules are in this so-called rules-based international order, what moral authority underpins those rules, and to whom they apply, when and where. So in my view, the liberal vision of a rules-based international order is essentially defunct. At the same time, however, there is no alternative world order that has emerged to supplant or replace it. Now, of course, you have Beijing and Moscow. They often talk about a multipolar order or a polycentric system of international relations. But frankly, I think such concepts are largely fictional. At best, they are vague aspirations. So in my view, it's not just that there is no liberal international order or rules-based international order today, there is no unitary world order at all. Instead, what we have, not a new world order, but a new world disorder. The global environment today is more fluid, more anarchic than at any time since the early 19th century. So what are its characteristics? Well, I think the first thing is the lack of agreement and clarity about the rules of the international system. And this has led to rules breaking on a almost serial scale. The former British Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, referred to an age of impunity. I think that's what we're seeing today. We are seeing the de-universalization of international norms. We regularly refer to universal norms. But what we really mean in the West are Western-led norms. I think elsewhere, in other parts of the world, they don't think about these as universal norms. At the same time, we have seen the much diminished authority of the great powers. We refer a lot to this is the age of the great powers. And yet the irony, the paradox is that the great powers have never been more limited in their capacity to impose global order or even to impose on some of the weakest and most backward nations in the world. I give you Afghanistan as exhibit A here. And at the same time, we're seeing the widespread denigration of multilateralism, multilateral institutions, multilateral norms. And this is accompanied by a crisis of leadership worse, in my view, than at any time since the 1930s. We are living in a hyper-globalized and yet also fragmenting world where we have intensifying conflicts over ideology, culture, identity. And we are also living in an increasingly anarchic information space, a sort of what people often refer to as a post-truth world, but perhaps the best way to describe it is it's a world dominated by competing truths. And all this is taking place when humanity faces unprecedented global and regional challenges, the drastic acceleration of anthropogenic climate change, the aggravation of global poverty and inequality, the sharp escalation of great power rivalries, and of course, most recently, the devastating impact of coronavirus. And all this time, governments and societies are struggling to adapt to breakneck technological and informational transformation. Can I just add a couple of words on the state of US leadership? Now, Joe Biden has announced that America is back. But what does that really mean? In my view, just because he says America is back doesn't mean that US global leadership is back, at least in the post-Cold War meaning of the term. In my view, America neither has the credibility, capacity, nor even the will to lead the world. Because although it remains the preeminent global power, power itself has become much more disaggregated and diffuse around the world. And few countries, including many of America's allies, look to Washington for global leadership. The world has moved on. And I think recent events, whether it's the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the creation of AUKUS, they've demonstrated also that America, not terribly surprisingly, frankly, will always prioritize American interests. Now, of course, Joe Biden has a very different style to Donald Trump. I heard this morning on the radio, someone described him as Trump with a smiley face. But nevertheless, America first remains the abiding principle of US foreign policy. And frankly, I'm not sure that even Joe Biden believes in a rules-based international order anymore, because increasingly we're seeing a much greater emphasis on smaller groups of like-minded countries, such as the Quad, such as the AUKUS. And it almost seems to me that Biden is referring back to George W. Bush's coalition of the willing. These are coalitions of the willing. Now, of course, broader multilateralism is still important in some areas like climate change. But generally, I think Washington, the Biden administration, is pushing increasingly to these sort of like, it doesn't really believe it can. It's just too hard to to develop big multilateral coalitions. So you focus on those like-minded countries. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Bobo. I'm just going to go to Peggy next. We just heard from Bobo the extent to which there really is more of an international disorder today than an international order. And I suppose one could make the case that any international order by definition has to be rules-based, at least to some extent, because there need to be some rules of the game, even if informal, for states to agree upon in order to regulate the relations between them. But is it not fair to say, Peggy, and certainly in your experience as a former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations for disarmament, is it not fair to say that the contemporary international order is more rules-based? Is it not sicker with more robust institutions? Or do those institutions not mean very much when the rules of the game are actually being contested between various different powers today? You're on mute, sorry, Peggy.
Thank you very much. And I'm very glad to follow Bobo, because I couldn't more fundamentally disagree with him. And that's because he hasn't talked about the most fundamental component of the existing international order, not contained in the nonsensical statement, rules-based international order, because it begs the question of whose rules. But the most fundamental aspect of the existing international order is international law, a feature of which has always been the tendency of great powers to step outside that law when they see it in their interest to do so. But by and large, and we're seeing a time where this is being tested further, but by and large, and I would argue this statement holds true now, great powers tend to stay more within and to abide more by international law than not. And of course, we're talking about the foundational vision of the UN Charter. We're talking about the web of treaties, many of which the United States has never ratified, but most notably the UN Law of the Sea, Convention on the Law of the Sea, but they act in accordance with it. most of the time. And of course, the all-important customary international law, which is binding on all states, whether they're inside or outside treaties. And, this is fundamental because in my view, it is the best means, it's the best means of constraining great powers, because the role of, whose role in any international order is critical, arguably even the defining component of the order, and which can be negative, neutral, or positive, depending on how they see their core or even peripheral interest affected. So my first point is you can't ignore international law, and it's incredible that anybody would ignore it. But the second point is that a feature, as fundamental as international law is, the ongoing challenge of trying to enforce international law. And of course, we have made an extraordinary step forward in that regard, and that is the International Criminal Court, which has come into force despite United States, despite the leading power. And it has the power to act, to impose its will in circumstances where the individuals, including leaders of governments, have not submitted themselves to the court's jurisdiction, which of course is the big difference from the International Court of Justice, where you have to have, where parties can reserve and limit the jurisdiction of the court. So so we're making progress on that defining challenge of the international order, which is how to make it more enforceable. And of course, the ultimate difficulty there is with respect to the biggest powers. But the point that's not new is that great powers have always declined to fully act within international law where they saw their core interests and certainly economic interests at stake. What's new now is that the United States is not the preeminent decider of when it will step inside or outside international law. Moving to a multipolar world, we're now seeing China challenging international law. Although I would argue, and we'll get into this, later, that even on the South China Sea, if you read the rulings, they are skirting, they are pushing, they are stepping outside the UN law of the sea, but they're doing it in ways that do not openly. They're not walking away from the UN law of the sea, because I think on balance they see it as in their interest. But I have to say, on the opening day of COP26, that we can't just talk about as important as international law is, we have to hold all this up against the fact that, according to the UN Secretary General, we face 3 existential threats. International orders have never had to face this before. Threats to the very survival of the planet. Climate, and it's not just climate change, although that's the big focus. It's also the destruction of nature. Nature is a key part of the answer to the climate threat, particularly trees, and also to preventing further pandemics. But current agribusiness practices and rapacious consumer economies are decimating trees and the natural habitat, and so are exacerbating, not ameliorating, the threat of climate change. And of course, ultimately, we depend on nature. So hence the devastation of nature is the second existential threat, which alas is not getting nearly enough coverage. And okay. So the third.
Thank you. We'll come back to that later if you don't mind.
I'll just end then with this point. The third existential threat, of course, is the threat of nuclear war, which inexorably is increasing with the arms racing that's going on. So the question with respect to the international order is that whatever international order we have and whatever state it's in, it has to be able to address those existential threats, or there's no future for humanity. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. We've got two more conceptual questions to unpack before I move on to the issue of China and Canada in particular. Andy, can we go to you next? I know that you've done a lot of research on global governance. And so my question for you is, if the rules themselves are being fundamentally contested today, how much can rules-based solutions actually work in terms of solving the problems of today's international order, if the rules themselves are not being agreed upon today? There's this idea that rules-based order, when there's a change in the balance of power, automatically solves its own problems by the need to create more rules. Do you see that as actually being the case, or does that no longer apply today?
Okay, that's a very important question, but I want to I want to go back to what Bobo Lowe had to say because I think I agree with him actually on a large part of what he said. I think that we are living in an interregnum, a period in which there is obviously a transition from the old world order that we've come accustomed to a new world order which has not yet been sort of defined. And I think I like to look at individuals like Gramsci and Robert Cox to get my inspiration on how to address this issue because obviously there is a deep crisis in the liberal world order of 1945. The liberal world international order is in very much deep crisis. We are in the midst of what is considered to be this grand transformation to this new world order. And we have to make sense of this interregnum period, first of all. It's a period in which I agree that this is a period of a new world disorder. It's not like an old medievalism because the technologies are different. We've advanced beyond that period of time, but it is similar in some respects. First of all, the pillars of Westphalia are crumbling and have crumbled. The pillars of that includes sovereignty, by the way. The sovereign state, which we sort of tenaciously hold on to, is questionable right now in terms of its ability to even get things done within the sovereign state. And that's seen with even the largest states like the United States not being able to handle many of the problems that are brought before us. So I think we need to further start there. And maybe we are moving into an era in which there is post-hegemony era. Robert Cox talks about this in his work, looking at the world order and the transformation of the world order. There's a shifting hegemony, of course, that's taking place right now. But the new world order that we are moving towards may be one in which there is no hegemonic power. No one can actually lead within that context. And I think we have to look at the foundational elements of world order first of all to try to understand the area that we're in. Ideas, institutions, and material capabilities. Those three foundational planks of world order are shifting right before us. So I'm going to leave it there because I think to answer your question, Zach, I think we need to first understand that we are in this interregnum period where everything is shifting around us.
Thank you very much, Andy. That's very helpful. Bobo, I see that you have your hand up for a two-finger, but I'm just going to let David come in first because he hasn't spoken yet, and then we'll come back to you. David, for you, a particular question concerning, again, the nature of today's international order, and Bobo raised this in his opening remarks, this idea that there's the rules-based international order, but sometimes you hear the term liberal international order as well. Are those two things the same thing, or are they different things? And to what extent is U.S. hegemony or leadership a part of one more than it is a part of the other? I think that's worth unpacking because maybe the liberal international order and a rules-based international order are conceptually actually quite different.
I would agree. First of all, I can't believe I might be the optimist on this panel, but it looks like I might be, given all the dire warnings that we're hearing from our other panelists. I would also note that if Joe Biden is George Bush or Donald Trump with a smiley face, does that make Justin Trudeau Stephen Harper with nice socks? Because what we've seen is more of the same under the, maybe that one went under the radar, but I think what we're seeing under the Liberal government is not much that different from what we've seen from his predecessors. So I think there's a couple of things that we need to add here. I don't disagree with much of what's been said, but for Canada in particular, rules-based order, we've heard also the idea of a rule of law, which Chrysler Freeland was not fond of using. She preferred rules-based order, and I think also her successors have used or referred to a rules-based order, which I think is a broader, more generic term. When we think of a liberal international order, we're now looking at a situation where Joe Biden is trying to build this alliance of values around democracy and liberal values. But this seems like an opportunity to advance America's interests, often at the expense of its allies, as well as a tool to confront adversaries. So I'm going to set that aside because I think that's a much narrower interpretation of what we mean by international order. Rules-based order, I think, is well suited to what Canada's interests ultimately are. You need a predictive international environment because you're a trading nation. You need to engage with other countries, knowing that there's going to be some outcome that will be achievable for both parties, and prediction gives you that through some understanding of mutual interests, and that can be derived from a common set of rules. Secondly, you need some kind of risk management or risk mitigation strategy, which allows you to offset the behavior of individual countries that might be acting against your interests. And then you need to develop a capability to deliver on public goods, and public goods are ultimately things that all countries would benefit from. The most notable one would be a climate change agenda. And a rules-based order can help satisfy or help address all those three elements of outcomes that are in Canada's interest. So when Canada emphasizes a rules-based order, it is primarily because we are a small trading nation that cannot essentially exist in an environment where there's hegemonic powers, whether it's China or the US, who are acting unilaterally or against our interests. With that in mind, I would just qualify what I've heard about American behavior. I do think that the erosion of the international order did begin very much with the global war on terror about 20 years ago, where we saw the United States initiate a number of acts in terms of sanctions, interventions, policies that were not just simply oriented towards satisfying its own interests, but also undermined the interests of its allies. And I can't think of a better example of that than the use of sanctions, which have become the preeminent tool by the Americans to impose its will on both its adversaries as well as its allies. Now, what made the international order function was this assumption that the hegemon would ultimately be violating international law, with the interests of the international community, if you will, at hand. But what we've seen, in other words, as Peggy has argued, American exceptionalism was premised on it is the sovereign who makes the rules. It is also the sovereign who decides on when to violate those rules. But what we've seen repeatedly in the last 20 years, and most notably under the previous administration, as well as also under the Biden administration, is this tendency to violate those rules and place its own interests above and beyond the interests of its allies. And indeed, its allies are being harmed by its actions. And I can give you a very concrete example. I'd like to give you a very specific example where Canada is going to be harmed by its deepening relationship with the US. And it's the US Competition and Innovation Act, in which there are 37 specific references to Canada and 3 sections of legislation devoted solely to Canada. And if you read the items in that act, you will see that Canada is now being hamstrung by American policy to basically confront China and harness Canada's research capability, whether it's at the university level, whether it's in aerospace and defense industry, to engage with it in that confrontation with China. So ultimately what we're seeing is that Canadian interests might be hampered by its most closest ally in the pursuit of its interests. Let's be absolutely clear here. It is the US that has the challenge from China, not necessarily Canada. We need to find that balance between working constructively with the US. Obviously, it's a most important trading partner, but on the other hand, working closely with China. After all, China is going to be, or is now, the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. And within a decade, some have predicted it will overtake the US.
Sounds good, David. If you don't mind, we're going to get into Canada and Canada-China relations just a little bit later. I just want to give first, you have one final thing to say. Go ahead.
I was just going to add that ultimately what we need to do is figure out a balancing act as a strategy that would encompass engaging in the development of rules, if not an international order based on rules, where Canadian interests can be satisfied. I know I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but Canada is not in a position to be what I would call a policymaker. Rather, it doesn't have a grand strategy. Ultimately, it's going to be a policy taker, and that will require that we work alongside countries who also feel likewise that they are threatened by both U.S. and China's actions. I would only conclude by saying that what we're seeing is, yes, it's rule of law is essential, but what we're seeing is increasing tendency of the United States and its allies to work below the radar, circumvent international law. I disagree with Peggy that there's this sort of trend towards an increasing adherence to international law. It's precisely in the areas of economic cooperation and commerce and the use of technology where we're seeing the United States circumvent international law. There's no better example of that than the activities that have been undertaken by the U.S. in its covert missions in the Middle East, as well as in the South China Sea and so on. So.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for that. And we will come back to Canada shortly. I just first want to give Bobo a chance briefly to respond to a few of the points. Then we're going to have a couple of questions on China in particular and China's place in the international order. After that, we'll come back to Canada and we'll unpack what this all means for Canada. So Bobo, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Look, Peggy said you can't ignore international law. Actually, you can, and the great powers do. George Bush broke international law when he launched the invasion of Iraq in 2003, circumventing the UN. Russia broke international law when it went into Ukraine and just hived off Crimea. China broke international law when it utterly disregarded the judgment of the International Court of Arbitration in 2016. The point is, if you can't enforce international law, then you can't argue, in my view, that there is a rules-based order based on international law if it is regularly broken by great powers when they have the power and the capacity to do so. On rules, you asked about liberal international order, rules-based international order. The reason they become conflated is because post-Cold War, the United States was the sole superpower. So inevitably, it was basically, we won, so it's our rules. But I mean, let's not be naive about liberal rules here. Joe Biden's Alliance for Democracy, Summit for Democracy, is going to have countries like Poland, the Philippines, India, I think, participating. Now, these are countries with pretty shocking human rights records that have gone into a markedly illiberal direction. So again, liberal rules-based order, it's so unclear. And I just want to pick up on David's point. I completely agree that the erosion of the liberal rules-based international order has been going on since the Bush era. It's a mistake to think of Trump as having broken this order. Trump took advantage, just as China and Russia have taken advantage of the erosion of the rules-based international order, liberal international order, because essentially what 2003 did was it established a precedent for US exceptionalism. But also, because the Iraq invasion went so badly, it also exposed the ineptitude, the cat-handedness, as well as the immorality of the venture. And so it basically gave motive and opportunity to countries like China and Russia and other authoritarian regimes.
Could I add, I just want to follow up on that point. It wasn't just Iraq, of course, because then we have
of
Libya as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Which was the last gasp of the responsibility to protect agenda, in which Canada was complicit in the deliberate overthrow of the leader of Libya, which then had fallout throughout the Sahel with disastrous consequences for Mali, for example. So sometimes we fail to understand that we are partners in crime with a country that is violating international law. Barack Obama went on TV and said, we're only there to protect the people, which was a flat out, I guess, lie, if you wish. It was, frankly, the purpose here was to topple the government there and create chaos. And we've seen similar kind of actions in Syria and drone. Let's not get started on drone attacks. But we could lay all the problems at the doorstep, the American doorstep. But I think the premise here is that when you've lost your sovereign who underpins international order, who themselves are now behaving in a way that is in contradiction to the rules that they have established, they are in essence the architects of their own demise, and we are party to that.
Thank you very much, David. Peggy, you had a two-finger intervention, and then after that, I'm going to go to Andy and Bobo with a couple of questions about China and international order. So Peggy, go ahead.
Yes, I didn't say that there was greater adherence to international law. I said that great power non-adherence, which has been a feature from the beginning, is couched in terms of international law adherence. All of the examples that have been cited, and most noteworthy, the illegal, the 2003 blatantly illegal invasion of Iraq by United States, not so blatant that the British legal system did not try and justify it, although ultimately in the end they came, it was shown to be what it was, illegal. But consider the contortions that United States went through to justify its actions under international law, under the UN Charter. They argued that they were using self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. So the point is that if it was irrelevant, if it was in disarray, and if they didn't recognize its importance, then they wouldn't try and justify their actions on the basis of international law. And of course, China has learned its lesson well from the United States, that the great powers can step outside when they feel they need to, but they too justify their actions. They're not saying the law of the sea doesn't matter. United States is not saying the law of the sea doesn't matter. They're just, when they step outside it, they do so in a way that does not directly discredit international law. And that's my point. All of these other questions are very, very important about the nature of the aspects that are in flux in the international order. But international law is not, the problem right now is we're not moving it forward in areas like cyber where we need to move it forward. But that is far different from saying it's irrelevant, it's not there. It is the foundation on which we can have this kind of argument. And then I'm going to abuse my time and also say that I fundamentally disagree with Andy on sovereignty disappearing. I'm sorry. Sovereignty is not disappearing in United States. It's not disappearing in China. It's not disappearing in Russia. It's not disappearing in the majority of Western states. Illiberal democracies may be having a few challenges, but of course there's a tension. There's a tension between sovereignty and the UN Charter's non-interference in the internal affairs of states and human rights. That's a tension that's been there since 1945, and that's particularly acute now with the relative weakening, if I can put it that way, of the liberal international order, in large part because of the United States. So I'll stop having totally abused my two-finger intervention.
Peggy, that's fantastic. And it's great to see that this topic of what is the rules-based international order, what is the nature of international order, is so animating for all of you. I wish it were more animating for more people in society as well. So I'm very happy to see this. Andy, over to you. One could make the argument that during the Cold War, rival separate spheres of influence served as some sort of stabilizing factor in the international order, a bipolar world, mutual assured destruction, etc. Since the end of the Cold War, if not before, we've been living in an increasingly integrated and globalized world, a single international order, as it were, rather than two different international orders, a single international order of global scope. So my question to you is, to what extent, therefore, does any stable international order today need to be inclusive of all powers, including China? That is to say, to what extent can we build a rules-based order against China versus with China in today's globalized world?
Well, first of all, I have to say that, the international system as we knew it in 1945 created certain institutions like the United Nations system, right, in order to be able to preserve and protect the Westphalian concept of sovereignty and so on. The problem is that we are now living in what they would call an intermestic era, in which those boundaries between the domestic and the international are become so blurred that we have to consider a different way of doing things. The international system is no longer international in that sense. Then it is more intermestic as far as I'm concerned, and that means that the rules that we have set up under the international system are no longer applicable in this new setting. For example, the sovereignty-bound actors, which are largely part of what the old system, now have to take in consideration the sovereignty-free actors. NGOs, non-state actors are as important these days as state actors when it comes to trying to deal with making the rules of the game. So if we do not include those actors, and that includes not just including China, including the other major states, but also including non-state actors, then basically we're sort of we're not going to be able to govern in this new environment. So what I'm trying to say is we need to bring in not just China, but also non-state actors, smaller states. That's one of the reasons why we have all these new organizations like OASIS and SIDS, and FOSS, and some of these other smaller groups, like-minded states, as I think Bobo called them. All these states, all these organizations have been created now in order to be able to have a much more integrated way of dealing with the problems that are in front of us. So I think that's where we are at this particular injuncture.
Thanks very much for that, Andy. Bobo, I see you have your hand up as well, so I'll let you come back on that. But in your response, if you could also, in addition to that, if you could also help our audience understand a little bit about China's goals as well as it relates to the international order. We tend to view China in Canada and in the West more broadly as a revisionist power. I'm wondering if you can help us understand that. Does it have more status quo long-term games, more goals? Excuse me, not games. Or revisionist long-term goals? Is this a dissatisfied power that sees itself increasingly as a loser in terms of whether or not it's been accorded a political power in today's international order, or is the fact that it has been a beneficiary, economically speaking, for the past 40 years, a more important dynamic to consider? How should we understand China in the international order?
Okay. Wow. All right. Okay. So I want to pick up on Andy's point, because I couldn't agree more with him. I think we need to get away. I mean, we have, it seems to me, in so much of the commentary that we're seeing today, an obsession with great powers. It's almost as if the only players are great powers. And yet the irony is that they have seldom been more impotent. They can barely manage themselves, let alone anyone else. So this means that traditional great power diplomacy, some of you might have seen an article recently by Richard Haas calling for a concert arrangement. I mean, this is completely obsolete. This is unable to deal with a kind of global, universal challenges facing us. There is zero future in concert arrangements. This is not 1815, and we are not in Vienna. Now, multilateralism, for all its many frustrations, is the only way forward, because global threats like climate change, pandemic disease, they transcend national and ideological boundaries. Collective problems require collective solutions, as we've seen. Now, picking up directly on Andy's point, the only viable international order, and I'm not saying it's going to be easy to build, but the only viable international order is one that is inclusive, representative, and diverse, because it needs to reflect a world where power has never been more diffuse. So that means we need smaller states as well as great powers. We need non-state actors as well as national governments. We need informal networks as well as formal multilateral institutions, because you often hear this sort of this myth that somehow inclusiveness is the enemy of effective decision making. Actually, it's the other way around, because if you don't include key stakeholders, then you will find that they will be committed to making things go badly. As Lyndon Johnson said about Edgar J. Hoover, even if you have the awkward squad, you want the awkward squad inside the tent pissing out and not outside pissing in. And that's really important. Now on China, it's a really interesting case, because on the one hand, it's kind of an insecure power. But on the other hand, it thinks it's winning. It thinks it is rising and the West is in irrevocable decline. So there is a combination of insecurity and hubris that is shaping Chinese foreign policy, China's relations with the world. I'm worried that hubris is taking over, that they are more confident than unconfident. And they have overestimated the extent of Western decline. They have underestimated the very considerable resources and potential that the United States has. And they don't seem to care about how much they piss off everyone else, including not just the West, but also non-Western countries as well. So what this means for Canada is there's no easy way to engage, not just Canada, but everyone. There is no easy way to engage with a power like that, because under Xi Jinping, Beijing has abandoned many of the constraints that used to govern its dealings with the world. But I think if this is a lesson for Canada, but for every country, we need to engage with China as almost on its own terms. We cannot get sucked into ideas like, oh, there's a Sino-Russian axis of authoritarianism, a sort of an authoritarian international, and to think that China and Russia and authoritarian regimes think alike. They don't. They have different attitudes towards the world. They may be authoritarian, but in so many other ways, critical ways, they are very, very different. It's also really important, and I know you've got you've just got through the Huawei case at the moment, but it is a common misconception to believe that accommodating or being nice to powers like China will somehow elicit more reasonable behavior. That is not, frankly, how the Chinese leadership operates. Concessions made out of fear or anxiety are seen for what they are, as a sign of weakness, not of reasonableness. On the other hand, it's not much good hectoring China about the rules-based international order. That's just worse than useless. So overall, I think Canadian decision makers, not just Canadian, as I said, all decision makers in the West, they need to understand, what do they really want from China? What are their strategic aims? What vital national interests are at stake? And what costs are they prepared to pay in order to realize those objectives? And basically, to cut it short, they need to deal in the concrete and not in these feel-good, vague generalities such as rules-based international order, right side of history, alliance for democracy. That is useless. You really need to deal in the specific and the concrete, and all governments need to do that when they engage with countries like powers like China.
That's very useful. Thank you very much, Bobo. And let's go over to David, in fact, because this is a very good segue into asking what Canada's interests actually are, right? During the Cold War, Canada, as a means of stabilizing the international system and asserting its own influence, famously, quote unquote, punching above its weight, played an important role in building rules-based international mechanisms, multilateral mechanisms, and the like, peacekeeping most famously, but not limited to that. Now we're living in a different kind of international order, as we have been unpacking so far. It is structured fundamentally differently to the way that it was between 1945 and 1990. And so in your view, do we still have that fundamental interest in creating rules-based mechanism, or actually have Canadian interests on the world stage shifted to a certain extent? And you're on mute, David.
I would preface your observations by arguing that globalization is becoming a transformative force that is diminishing in its capacity to bridge countries together. And by that, I mean that the three biggest countries, if not economies, are looking inwards. They're seeking to be self-sufficient. They're trying to de-link and reduce the dependencies they have on adversaries, China for the United States for China. And by that, then they're looking at domestic consumption as opposed to emphasis on trade. With that in mind, then Canada has the possibility to be on the losing end of a diminishing globalized economy, because it is very much focused on international trade. It's the key and primary driver for our welfare. And ultimately, we need to think about a way in which to engage China. I would argue that there are three constraints in play. One is the bifurcation of key policy areas. On the one hand, we have the defense and security communities, the bureaucracies that are deeply integrated within the United States. They are more than willing to take a conflictual and confrontational approach in line very much with US interests. We see more often than not these people being cited in the press as to how threatening China is to Canadian interests. On the other hand, we have commerce, trade, investment, and diplomacy, where a more cooperative and ultimately more independent strategy must be pursued. It ultimately must be multilateral. We're not alone in thinking like this. I think there's some allies who are trying to hedge their bets and pursue strategies that are both cooperative and confrontational. The question is, can Canada free itself of both American and Chinese influence to pursue a path of its own? And I would suggest that Canada has to play in the same domain as China and be a voice for moderation, but it needs to be very selective where it chooses to play. For example, there are those institutions that need to be rethought and done better. For example, we have something called FinDev, which is the financial arm of our development agency, which is intended to invest in developing countries. China outdwarfs it by a huge amount. I mean, it's just not very effective, and it's not what the developing countries need. Canada is focusing on small, medium enterprises, for example, whereas the Chinese are billion-dollar infrastructure builders. They are outstripping our ability to deliver on what sub-Saharan Africa needs, for example. We've just seen the G20 wrap up. It wasn't very effective. COP26 also wrapped up. These are areas where Canada has an opportunity to be a voice for moderation. Instead, what we've seen is Justin Trudeau play the domestic card by suggesting that he wanted more on the climate change agenda, but no other country was willing to listen to that. That's pure pandering to the domestic audience, rather than actually moving the agenda forward and getting other countries to commit to a climate change policy. Then there are those areas where I think there are actual potential risks and harm to Canada. I mentioned CUSMA as a potential risk for Canada, although one may not think of it in those terms. With the America First agenda now pushing Canada to be more deeply integrated in its anti-China policies, I think we'll see even greater pressure applied on Canada with respect to how we work alongside the United States in the intelligence, aerospace industries, and defense industries. We've already seen the kind of pressure placed on Canadian universities in that regard. So one needs to be cautious in those areas. And then there are those institutions where Canada can choose to hedge its bets. For example, Canada is a member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, as well as obviously a member of the World Bank. And in those areas, I think Canada has an opportunity to listen, balance its interests, and see where it wants to play. Withdrawing from institutions like we saw in the case of the Americans, withdrawing from the WTO, withdrawing from the WHO is not in Canada's interest. We need to have as recognizing it's a small voice, we need to have a voice at the table. So ultimately, we're not going to see a grand strategy emerging from Canada. What we need is a very issue-specific approach where Canada can manage the risks that are presented to it from both the United States and China. We need to realistically think about how Canada can support the delivery of public goods. If indeed you're committed or wedded to a rules-based order, that's what it's all about. It's not about satisfying your interests. It's meeting the needs of other countries. They will only participate if they think there's something in it for them. The Americans seem to have lost that concept, that America first means America first, and you will be part of that, or you will face the consequences when you are punished by us, either directly through sanctions or other kind of extraterritorial overreach. So ultimately, Canada needs to pursue a risk management strategy that is convey both the consequences and the opportunities for engaging in an international environment where there's increasing exposure to risk for Canada being a trading nation. But ultimately, that's the only choice we have. We cannot, and we will never develop a grand strategy. We're not a policy maker, we're a policy taker. There are very specific areas, and I would just close off by suggesting, delinking from China is not an option. That's what I think the defense and security community that's their dream world. But even when we pursue a free trade agreement with Indonesia, which we're in the process of doing, their largest investor is China. Even when we work alongside Brazil, their largest investor is China. When we start to think of developing a free trade agreement or some kind of trade agreement with Sub-Saharan Africa, the biggest player there is China. So working alongside China directly or indirectly is going to happen. And so we need to find a solution in which we can ensure that our interests are not at cross purposes with this very important player, despite the pressure brought to bear by the United States on us to delink from our exposure to China.
Understood. Thank you very much, David. Very thought-provoking. Andy has to leave a little bit early. So Andy, I'm just going to give you an opportunity to give some closing thoughts in 2-3 minutes, if you don't mind.
Sorry about this, that I have to leave for another meeting, but I just want to say that the problem that we face today in terms of Canada-China relations is that we are still very much caught up in our relationship with the United States. So whatever we try to do, we have to take in consideration that Canada-US relationship. And are we going to maintain that relationship at the time that the United States is actually losing its hegemonic status internationally? China doesn't want to become a hegemon, apparently, because it doesn't like the term hegemony. It doesn't like to use that term, but it acts very much like a predominant power globally now. So we're looking at global China, and we have to be able to sort of find a new way of dealing with global China. That means that we will have to disagree with the United States on a number of fronts. And I think this is one of the challenges that we have, because we're still very much living next door to the United States. I think it was Lloyd Asworthy that talked about living next door to the United States is like making love to a porcupine. The difficulty is you can do it, but it's very, very difficult. And that difficulty will continue to remain as long as we are next door in proximity to the United States. So I'm going to leave it there because I have to run off to this meeting. But thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
For sure, Andy. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And we're going to pick up from there and spend the final 15 minutes of our panel now. So everyone else, please do stay with us. We're going to spend the final 15 minutes of our panel now unpacking what all of this means for Canada-China relations. I'm going to start with Peggy. Again, going back to what we've been talking about so far, about the difference between a liberal order and a rules-based order. What would Canada be content with, right? Is Canada actually content to live in a world where it and its other Western allies can remain safe, liberal democracies, preserve their values at home, but by and large, they occupy a more and more peripheral role in the international order, which remains rules-based increasingly, but in which liberal values, are on the retreat by and large? Are we content in Canada with that? Or rather, do we have more of a values-based, megaphone-type diplomacy? Is that our number one priority actually over the longer term? And what would that imply, therefore, for our relationship with China? If we're more committed to the liberal element of international order than to the rules-based element of international order, does that mean that we have to prepare ourselves for basically some form of a permanent state of rivalry with China? based on values of some sort, or rival political systems, which naturally breeds a security competition, between China and Western powers? Is that what we have to prepare ourselves for effectively?
Thank you. Well, I mean, I largely agree with the kinds of constraints and opportunities that David Carman has outlined for Canada. I mean, our values-based diplomacy is not completely empty. I mean, I think we do believe in human rights, for example, and certainly, that's something that has great resonance with respect to the Canadian public, when many areas of foreign policy do not. But the problem with our promulgation, our promotion, our championing of human rights is that it is completely hypocritical and selective. And we criticize non-allies and non-friends. And we stay well clear of criticizing allies and friends. And with respect to, for example, our arms exports, we actively participate and facilitate human rights abuses by some of the worst countries, and in flagrant disregard of our obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty. So human rights and values are very important, but the single most important thing that Canada can do is end the hypocrisy and lead by example. So end the megaphone diplomacy and lead by example. I mean, we're starting to do that, on the Aboriginal file, but there are, Israel and the rights of Palestinians, our arms exports. There are many other areas where we need to. We need to do better. But to me, I mean, I agree with what David said. We can't delink from China, and we're a trading nation. We can't delink from the world. The real challenge that Canada is facing, it seems to me, is how to play as small a role as possible in, and ideally join with moderate voices in the US, and there are many, to curb the extremely hostile and aggressive US military posture to China, which is driven not just by economic imperatives, but also by domestic, Biden's weakness domestically, politically in the US. And that, of course, that hostile military posture is putting at risk areas where the US wants to cooperate with China, particularly on climate change. So we need to exercise what room to maneuver we have to disassociate ourselves, to not associate ourselves as much as we can. And of course, this is very difficult given the alliance structure, but not associate ourselves with that. And a very practical way we can do that, one very practical example, is what New Zealand has done. And of course, my argument is if New Zealand can do it, then Canada can certainly do it. And that is part of this onslaught by United States is to use Five Eyes intelligence network to coordinate statements condemning China. It was, first one was on Hong Kong, and the second one was on the Uyghurs. And the statement on the Uyghurs was where New Zealand drew the line and said, no, we're not going to. They said it very diplomatically. They said, we believe there are multilateral opportunities for us to raise these issues, i.e., very diplomatic language to say, a spy, an arrangement of spies is not the place where foreign policy should be prosecuted. Of course, it's in the United States' interest. That's another way. I mean, they control Five Eyes because they're the ones that provide them the most information. And so coordinating foreign policy statements through Five Eyes is the dream world for them. So we've got to put a stop to things. We've got to just not go along with it as New Zealand has done, has shown the way. And by the way, that's a long-standing principle, foreign policy principle, is that the intelligence agencies inform. They do not make foreign policy, but increasingly that line is being blurred. So just to end on the point of where our interests are at, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done, on the international trade side. But I was very disappointed with Canada's very cool. The Prime Minister, was a statement by the Prime Minister's cool reception to China's interest in joining the Trans-Pacific Comprehensive Agreement, CPTPP, when clearly it is in our interest to enmesh them further within international agreements on trade. And because they're not going to follow, and this is the same with the US, because we know they're not going to follow every aspect of it, doesn't mean that it isn't better to have them enmeshed in the system and following most of it. And the final practical thing that Canada can do, and this relates to the South China Sea, and actually all Southeast Asian actors should be doing this. Anyone that has a boundary dispute in that area, and Canada doesn't have a boundary dispute there, we have many other boundary disputes, many in the Arctic, and some with United States, and some with others, including Russia. But we should, and the ones with Russia are following the normal rules for settlement under international law. But others, including some of the ones with the US, we have reservations on international arbitration or the reach of the International Court of Justice. And if we want to put our money where our mouth is on international law, and be in a far more credible position to criticize China on its actions in the South China Sea, we should be removing all reservations to boundary dispute arbitration, and we should be urging South Asian actors to do the same. And oh, by the way, we should be urging the United States to ratify the law of the sea, which it's constantly invoking in terms of China breaching the law of the sea.
Sounds good, Peggy. Thank you very much. That's a very good segue. You mentioned New Zealand and the Five Eyes. We have a quick question for Bobo regarding your career as an Australian diplomat. I'm wondering if you can give us some insight as to Australia's approach towards China so far, which is somewhat different from New Zealand's, to say the least. How's that working out so far for Australia, and how do you anticipate that it will work out over the medium to longer term, and what lessons should Canada draw?
Okay, great. Just before I get onto that, can I just say something about add something about China? I think it's important.
Just so you know, we've got 8 minutes left, so if you could be concise.
It'll just be 30 seconds. It's not very useful to describe China as a malign actor, but let's not sugarcoat it. In many ways, its policies are hostile to those of Canada and many Western countries. Xi Jinping talks about win-win and shared destiny for humanity, but really, China pursues a realist foreign policy. It is a China first policy in the same way that Trump and other presidents have pursued an America first. So let's be under no illusions here. Okay, the Australian example. In my opinion, Australia offers no sort of example for Canadian foreign policy, because Canberra really operates on the principle of all the way with LBJ. During the Vietnam War, the then Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt, the one who drowned off the coast, he didn't just agree to US proposal for Australia to participate in the Vietnam War. He actively volunteered. He wanted Australia to be like this with the United States, to be its most valued partner. Now, of course, it's natural that Australia should be an ally of the United States, but this does not have to mean that it should be a stalking horse for every initiative and cliche emanating out of Washington. Because the problem for Australia is that this excessively tight embrace, rather clingy sort of embrace of the United States limits Australia's strategic flexibility. It undermines its position and influence in the Asia Pacific. And in fact, it effectively reduces it from being a middle power to a strategic annex of the United States. So if we talk more specifically about AUKUS, the problem with AUKUS is not that it targets China. The problem with AUKUS is that it highlights Australia first and foremost as part of the global Anglosphere rather than as a sovereign player in the Asia Pacific. And as such, it recalls really the Australian foreign policy of the 1950s and 60s. I would also say that Australia is an anti-model for for Canada when it comes to climate change, the most critical challenge facing us. Australia leads the world, at least under the Scott Morrison government, it leads the world in denialism, obfuscation, and obstruction in addressing the problem of climate change. So if Canada is serious about looking at a model, I mean, the New Zealand analogy is reasonable, although New Zealand is a very small country. So but let's look at two others. I think Canada would be much better off not looking to Australia, but to other US allies like Japan in Asia and Germany in Europe, because these two countries are unequivocally liberal, but they pursue sovereign foreign policies.
Thanks very much, Bobo. We've got just 4 minutes left, so I'm going to give a final word to David and then to Peggy just to close us off. David, we've just got a quick question from the audience, if you don't mind weighing in, which concerns Taiwan, whether Canada is prepared for a potential conflict over Taiwan and what role, if any, Canada could play in helping to de-escalate that situation. And if you could just provide a final concluding thought on where Canada-China relations should be. What should our aspirations be for our relations with China in 5 years or 10 years' time? What should that look like in your view? We've got 4 minutes left, so 2 minutes to you and 2 minutes to Peggy.
Let me just say, that was the same question I was asked by a military officer, U.S. military officer, about 2 months ago on a panel in the United States. And I think it's a silly question. I'm not even going to entertain the idea that there should be a confrontation or war over Taiwan. Why that should be a question we'd want to consider when there are so many more important pressing issues. First of all, Canada, no more Meng Wanzhou's. Do not let that happen again. We were hamstrung. We were pressured by the U.S. to accept an outcome that worked against our interests. There's absolutely no question on that. No more pandering to domestic audiences. This is my dream list, of course. There's constructive policy and there's constructive politics. And what we have right now is pure politics, very, very limited constructive policy. That's why we have this panel, right? Because we don't have a significant imaginative policy-making apparatus in Canada. They're looking for answers. So ultimately, it comes down to pandering to the domestic audience, which is right now very much focused on an anti-China agenda. I would say that we have to avoid being caught up in the same kind of limitations that the Americans are now imposing on themselves through the use of unlawful means to pursue a confrontational agenda against China. There's a number of things that are beyond the purview of the Canadian public that we're doing in response to an authoritarian regime that is acting in very much the same way. But we are guided by the rule of law domestically. And right now, Canadians need to ask, what exactly is our government doing that is going against our interests as a model, if you will, of the rule of law? If we expect to project these outward, how are we circumventing the rule of law, both domestically and internationally? I think there are a number of things that need to be done, but as I've said before, issue by issue, policy by policy, manage the risk, confront when necessary both China and the US when it doesn't suit our interests, go along and when it does, and be constructive as much as possible. We're not doing enough of the questioning of the American agenda, which is quite disturbing when you look, again, I will repeat it, when you look at the particular focus on Canada's inclusion in the US Competition and Innovation Act, where Canada will be hamstrung to such an extent, we won't know what hit us.
Thanks very much, David. Last word to you, Peggy. Again, in 5 to 10 years, where should Canada-China relations be in terms of our own national interests? And what would that imply, in your view, for our relationship with the United States? If you can leave us with that thought. What's the more important priority for Canada? Is it advancing this independent conception of international order and China's role in it? or is it simply tending our relationship with the United States over the next 5 to 10 years as the United States goes through convulsions, very unpredictable convulsions of its own?
First of all, I want to say that I'm so happy to be able to agree so wholeheartedly with Bobo about not emulating Australia in terms of our foreign policy when it comes to China. And in answer, in a nutshell, Zachary, to your question, we don't have the luxury of either or, and that's the challenge for Canadian foreign policy. We have to. And it requires smart diplomacy, something we used to be good at. And that, unfortunately, is more difficult now because, as I keep going on about, there needs to be a rebuilding exercise, a dedicated rebuilding exercise of diplomatic capacity at Global Affairs, because we have to exercise the limited independent room to maneuver that we have. It is there, and we need to start. I mean, the Liberals have, in their election campaign, committed to a new Asia-Pacific strategy. I'm very glad that they use the term Asia-Pacific and not Indo-Pacific strategy, and they need to get to work on that. And one of the fundamental questions there has to be, how do we practically, pragmatically speaking, disassociate ourselves from these most troubling and dangerous aspects of American foreign policy, as I said, driven in large measure in some cases by there's a very right-wing bipartisan consensus on China in Washington, so that's the go-to U.S. position, backed up by a huge weapons lobby, which is extremely happy with the new enemy that we need to gird ourselves against. But the point is, Canada has got some room to maneuver. I mean, during the Cold War, we exercised this room to maneuver. When I was ambassador for disarmament, we voted differently from the United States on international security questions, where we had to vote, stand up and be counted more than half the time. So it can be done, but it takes a confident bureaucracy and it takes a smart policy. And so that's where we need to start.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Peggy. We're out of time, unfortunately. We're going to have to wrap it up there, but it's great to have such food for thought because, as you say, Peggy, we don't have the luxury of either or in terms of tending our relations with the US and building some sort of durable or functional relationship with China. But at the same time, Canada's resources are limited. Its goals need to be targeted, as we heard during this panel as well. So a lot of food for thought there, but how we can do all of those things at the same time, how we can have to do such amazing and enormous things, as I should say, while at the same time targeting our efforts. So certainly more research, more thought is required there. And I look forward to doing it with you and with everyone else on this panel as a part of the and others who will be a part of the China Strategy Project. David Carman, thank you for joining us. Peggy Mason, Bobo Lowe, thank you very much. Hope we'll see you again very soon. Thank you for joining the Institute for Peace and